Hello and welcome to another episode of Monday Bible, where we explore the fascinating intersection of AI and law. I'm your host, Michał Jackowski, and today we have a very special guest with us, Alex Hamilton. Alex has a remarkable background, having served as a partner in the London office of Latham and Watkins and co-chair of the Global Technology Transaction Group, and now he leads Radiant Law as CEO. This is a firm that is revolutionizing how large companies create, negotiate, and manage their commercial contracts. He's also the author of the influential book Sign Here, the Enterprise Guide to Closing Contracts Quickly, which is now in its second edition, including insights on AI. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Michał. That's very, very kind.
Can you start by giving us an overview of how AI is currently being utilized in contracting process?
Well, there's a lot of talk about AI being used in the contracting process. How much it's actually being used, I'm not so sure. So the two traditional areas where it was being used and had the biggest impact was firstly extracting information, finding stuff in contracts. So it was kind of famously Kira and so on. And a lot of Luminance, whatever, lots of tools doing that. Useful for contract review projects, useful for populating CLMs or contract management databases. And then you've got a second set of tools like Legal Sifter, which we use sometimes, which is really to review the other side's paper. And it's, again, the same thing. It's clause recognition. But this time they add some rules to it. So you either want to see this clause or you don't want to see this clause, basically. So it's a good way of kind of going through a document and saying, I was expecting to see X and it's not here, or I didn't want to see Y and it is here. So that's kind of traditional ML, machine learning. And then you've got generative AI, which is being sprinkled on everything. There are all those demos on LinkedIn of markups of contracts actually being done, which was hard with the machine learning stuff. But now, kind of weave in the drafting. But unfortunately, every example that I've seen, and I'm assuming they're putting their best examples up, every example I've seen has been an absolute disaster for the showcase markups. So I'm a little skeptical around it directly interacting with the contract for that reason and others.
Okay, so maybe we should go a step behind, and I should ask you, because you wrote this fantastic book, Sign Here, crucial resource for many in the industry. So what is new in your second edition? What was really interesting in the first edition and what's new in the second edition? What are key additions and how do you perceive contract lifecycle management, contracting, negotiating, and technology?
Sure. You're just winding me up here. You know where I'm going with this. So, like, the original book made the point that contracting is, and kind of commercial contracts, day-to-day contracts between businesses, right? The stuff that's negotiated, the stuff that Radiant does, like you said, at scale for clients. So, a starting point is I think this is generally a disastrous area, and it's an important area. So it's important because lifeblood of the company, et cetera, et cetera. This is critical, these relationships. Disastrous because the contracting process generally focuses on the wrong issues. It has too little process, too little tech applied to it. But most of all, it's like stupid drafts begetting stupid markups from the other side and stupid arguments over the wrong points, which ultimately undermine the relationship. And the point I'm particularly making was it's the relationship that matters, not the contract, right? The contract's just a trust building framework to get you going on a relationship. The value is created through the relationship. And so a process which focuses on aggressive arguments around liability clauses and indemnities and other such nonsense, right, generally gets in the way of building great relationships. And World CC has repeatedly in their surveys found that people spend all their time negotiating indemnities, liability clauses, and so on. Except what goes wrong is people don't know what they're buying, what they're selling, what the payments are. That's where it generally goes wrong, right? It's either not really deliverable or not really what you want to be delivered, right? Depending on which side you are. So that seemed to me deeply problematic. And then in the book, I kind of spell out a 3-step process, basically, of making your contracting process repeatable, adding some robots and automation, and then a never-ending continuous improvement refinement cycle. So that was kind of book 1. Book 2 same message, hasn't got desperately better in the 3 years since it was published. I think I started to think about doing a second edition when, first of all, CLM, contract lifecycle management, became a big topic. I dealt with before the kind of the differences, playoffs between a kind of an end-to-end system and a point solution, just one part of the process, and had been fairly neutral on it, towards point solutions, fairly neutral. But CLMs became a big thing, and that worried me because we were seeing more and more problems in practice with that approach. And then Gen AI happened, and that was interesting and shocking. And I was surprised, especially when I saw GPT-4. So I felt I needed to address that. So kind of we can come back and talk about those two particular topics. But on the process of adding to the book with the on the technology side, what I realized was I think I got it wrong the first time round, in that I put too much emphasis on tools, steps to improve things, and not enough on behavior. And I think a lot of the problems on further reflection are actually coming about from how we all behave in the contracting process. And so really, I think the most important stuff that I've added, although people turn to the AI saying, what's Alex said now? Most important stuff is about thinking about how we behave, both in terms of in the negotiation process and so on, but also in improving contracting, and ultimately about how we create relationships and are we trustworthy and so on, and kind of more purposeful perspective on that. So that's the stuff I'm most passionate about. Like I said, everyone's going to ask me about CLM and AI. So ask me about CLM and AI.
It's really interesting because everyone now speaks about legal project management, contract lifecycle management tools, and you put emphasis on behavior and, let's say, traditional methods of contracting. So can you say how we should balance it in the world of generative AI? Of technologies influence the methods or the system we use. So how we should balance it? What's your point of view?
I think it's kind of an obvious thing of get your lands in order first. And I'm very keen on short, clear, reasonable, relevant contracts, and getting rid of, I think it's the closest we have to a silver bullet in contracting in terms of solving problems. But having kind of the discipline of kind of taming what you're doing and doing in a repeatable way. And then I always have been keen on technology. So I think technology can really help that. But Gen AI made me really rethink, or think harder at least, what I'm trying to do. And I think you can basically say there are two parts. First of all, contracting is knowledge work. And there are two parts to it, really. One is the kind of knowledge work around how do you do it and the process. And then another around the content, like what are the terms actually end up in your contract and so on. And I spell out a simple model in the book around routine to innovative work. So I think you can put work on a spectrum, and I think parts of a deal could be more innovative. A lot of them are going to be routine. And I think that's true around the issues that come up. So the content, I think it's also true around the process. And I was already pushing before for taming your process because I think it is standardizable. But I think it's an even heavier emphasis on making tacit knowledge more explicit, taming kind of the content side and trying to make it more routine, because that brings both consistency and reliability to your contracting process, but also recognizing that there are situations where process is not that helpful, right? Trying to write everything down is not that helpful. There are novel situations. What we've really got is too much chaos in the process, so everything's treated as novel, whereas a lot of it doesn't need to be, on the one hand. But on the other hand, if you go too far down that route, then you're not really engaging in how to create a great relationship. You're just working by the numbers and being very robotic. This makes sense. So kind of when you think about when Gen AI fits into this, right? I think that, say, okay, at the routine end of the spectrum, does it help? At the innovative end of the spectrum, does it help? And does it help you get from innovative to routine? Right. So on the routine end, I'm not a big fan because it is a random word generator that keeps on spitting out, even if you drop the temperature, different answers, right? And I think reliability, consistency is super important. And we've also got technology that is so boringly old, like 40 years old, with document automation, for example, which, I think just about every contract Radiant's created with document automation. He says, touch wood. That works. And it's deterministic. In other words, it will give you the same result every time with the same input. It's a well understood solution. There are lots of solutions out there. We use DocAssemble, an open source one, and it's a solved problem. So my argument is at the routine end of the work, you want to be heading towards deterministic systems wherever possible. And I think, people talk about drafting every contract with Gen AI. I'm like, this is an absolute disaster. I mean, I read a paper about it in November last year. You find it on LinkedIn, like just going, here are 5 experiments I did with NDAs, trying to regenerate them, right? The only way you can get the same contract out of Gen AI is basically put everything in at the beginning in the prompt, right?
Yes.
So don't do that at home, right? So then the second topic is, can Gen AI help with innovative work or novel work and so on? I think, yeah, it can. Because if you're basically saying someone, to somebody, this topic might be novel, but to other people, it might be routine, right? I mean, that's kind of what expertise looks like. Mm-hmm. I think helping people, including experts, but also people exploring an area for the first time in their career, being able to explore ideas in Gen AI is super helpful. And I find it very useful. I talk about it kind of prompting my brain rather than prompting the computer, right? So rather than give me a wall of text, which my brain will switch off and I won't fully, give it the attention it probably needs because it's so potentially dangerous in subtle ways in contracts. Give me a set of bullets. Give me some points to think about. Give me some options. And, your brain then goes from 0 to 60 and it's like, okay, yeah, well, that's wrong. That's fine. That's good. I hadn't thought of that. That's interesting, right? So I think it's a super useful tool to explore stuff, but you're not replacing humans. This is empowering humans, right? So bionic lawyer, not robotic lawyer. And then the third area was taking innovative work and making it more routine, which I don't think people like the idea of because that sounds more boring, but there's a value to it of the consistency, reliability, making it go away, makes it easier to automate and therefore spend more time doing more ambiguous, gray area, thoughtful work and less time just churning contracts in a random way that takes, too much effort to too little value. So I think Gen AI can again be helpful to some extent in simplifying things. I mean, I've used it to write a lot of code. I get my developers to then go over it when it's actually kind of like, I don't always confess on Monday mornings. I've gone into production with some code I wrote on the weekend because I couldn't wait for it, but you might want to check it. That kind of situation, right? So that's cool, at least for me, not developers. But I do think that there are areas where it can help simplify things and cut things out and so on. And so great. Again, you're very focused on the output. You're very focused on it, as opposed to it just being a blur of, you just, keep generating stuff in this random word generator. So that's kind of roughly how I'm thinking about Gen AI. So I think, therefore, it shocked me and it was quite helpful in places. I think we're kind of got through the hype now. We're kind of heading down towards the bottom of the Gartner hype cycle and what have you. And there will be point solutions. But, I've got a bet on Twitter with Casey Flaherty, and I argue that 5 years it won't have 5% impact in reducing stuff. And I don't know if I win or not in reducing time on contracting. And, I may well lose. But I think if I do lose, it's because people do really dumb stuff. Like rather than putting document automation in place, they decide that every contract being different in their contract portfolio seems fun. And so, right. So I think it will, if I'm wrong, it's because I underestimated how lazy humans are.
I think you can both win and lose. Yes, I agree that especially lawyers prefer to draft everything from scratch very often instead of automation,
Yeah.
automating documents. But what advice would you give to companies, including law firms, that are just starting to implement AI in their contracting process? How should they approach it?
So I think that most companies haven't done most steps in sorting out how they do their contract. And in fact, most companies have done very few steps in sorting it out. And looking at AI as something that's just going to make all the pain go away, I think is a mistake. So I'm going to sound like a good Puritan at this point, but like I urge people to do the basics of just getting simple templates and being thoughtful about their processes. And, we can talk about CLM, but probably not rushing at CLM, but instead just getting the good stuff in place on the one hand. And on the other hand, encouraging their team to experiment with Gen AI to get a sense of where it might help. So I don't want to say don't ever use it. I use it pretty regularly, and I find it helpful at times even. But it is not a panacea. It's not a silver bullet, and so I think you're better off just doing stuff and experimenting, right? But that's a boring message. People don't want to hear that, so they're going to ignore me. They're going to go around going, "This is really exciting." Then it's going to not quite solve everything, and then they're going to be the same place in 2 years' time, and here we are.
So yeah, you said that in 2 years we will not move probably from the place we are here, or probably advance a lot. But this is my last question: what excites you the most about the future of contracting, and is it related to AI or to something else? What should our listeners be looking out in the coming years?
The thing that excites me the most is that my whole message about it's all about humans and it's all about relationships seems to be resonating with at least some people in the industry. And I do feel that there is a group forming that basically is arguing that we can just make things simpler, easier, and focus on the very human dimensions of a relationship. I mean, relationships are between humans.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm afraid this is the completely boring answer. Is what excites me is that I think people are now getting more comfortable in saying, no, it's not about the tech. Tech's great and all the rest of it. This is about creating great relationships and dealing with humans and trying to be constructive. And I love every time I find someone like that.
So where is your place in this future of contracting with humans in the loop? How do you see yourself in this future of
Yeah,
contracting
I
and
mean,
your law and your firm?
yeah. So, and I said there's a paper I wrote. Radio made I've got skin in the game in this one because I've basically taken a tech-enabled services approach rather than a tech approach. And, your listeners should judge what I say accordingly, right? I have incentives here to maybe argue the things that I'm arguing, but I also took that position in terms of building the firm because I think we massively underestimate the complexity of the real world. Right, when the tech-enabled approach of tech-first approach assumes that the world people fill in the form correctly and people do stuff in a thoughtful, sensible, rational, makes sense way. They don't. I mean, it's total mayhem how large organizations operate with each other, right? So, and also, I think fundamentally that humans create relationships with humans, and so therefore, the idea of Gen AI agents negotiating with each other. Maybe, I read more than my fair share of science fiction. I've read about that and there way back in the day, but it's like not exactly my idea of the future that I want to live in, right? I mean, running joke in the UK about computer says no, right? This is kind of weaponized computer says no. This is not a good idea. So I think that it's always going to be humans dealing with humans to figure out how to make something work. It's all edge cases and exceptions. But on the way through, we in turn at Radio need to be routinizing stuff, making it easier and easier. We run at half-day turnarounds, right? We get contracts drafted, your contract red lights dealt with in half a day, 4 hours, like day in, day out, right? We're 85% of the time. No one else is at that speed, right? But we do that just by focusing on processes, well, some tech and so on, but just really thinking about how we work. So I think our job is to get rid of the noise, reduce the amount of negotiations, make sure that the negotiations are focusing on the things that really matter, and figuring out how we can create more value for the parties and creating these relationships and managing these relationships. So I don't think there's any cap on how much value you can create. I think if you have the incentives aligned like we do with fixed price only, no timesheets and so on, that's necessary. It's not sufficient because so what, other than it's helpful for the client, know what they're going to pay. But I think gives us the opportunity to keep figuring out new ways of adding value. So that's what we think the game is. And using Gen AI where it helps, right? We've got the perfect structure to absorb Gen AI. I've just been underwhelmed with the use cases and so on in practice. We've got a group looking at how we can use it and so on. But we spent last year building an integrated data layer across the firm, and right, yes. That's where we invested our time, and in standardizing how we do our process and continually improving them and upping the rate at which we do continuous improvement. That's kind of where we think the real value is.
I think this is an answer of somebody who knows the world of contracting very well, and you don't repeat all the same clickbait stories that internet is full of. Thank you for joining me today and sharing your insights. This is really invaluable knowledge and experience, and I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot. And for those interested in diving deeper, I highly recommend the second edition of your book. I will link it also under the episode. Thank you, Alex, for being here.
Well, thank you. Lovely to see you again.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a thumbs up, subscribe the channel, and stay tuned for next episodes of Monday Bible. Until next time, goodbye.